Fair pay agreements wouldn't be fair to bosses, according to the Employers and Manufacturers Association. A working group led by former Prime Minister Jim Bolger has released a report setting out ways to lift wages and improve working conditions. It says only 10% or 1,000 workers should be needed to trigger fair pay agreement negotiations. But the group was divided on whether all businesses should be forced to follow any new rules. Paul Jarvie is the Employment Relations and Safety Manager for the EMA. I asked him, what's wrong with being fair to your workers?
Well, I think you've got to look at the other end of that comment. It's agreements, and the way it's triggered, only 10% have to agree for something to happen, so that's wholly agreement. So, look, we've got no problems with staff getting higher wages. In fact, we're pushing that ourselves. But the question's got to be asked: how do businesses pay for higher wages when they're running mean and lean at the moment? And we think that this very blunt approach will not achieve what its goals are.
Okay, there's a few things there. To start with, you say that that employers are aiming for higher wages. If that's the case, if we look at some of the industries that they considered, food preparation assistants, 91% of them are getting below $20 an hour. Checkout operators, 91% below $20 an hour. Hospitality workers, 84%. 78% of packers and product assemblers, less than $20 an hour. That's the point, isn't it? You're not doing it on your own. You need to be forced.
Well, you could argue that, but equally there are a lot of other businesses out there that are paying more than that. Companies run on being profitable, that they have to make a profit to satisfy either themselves if their own business or their shareholders. So money's tight out there. People think that these businesses are flush with money, but in fact they are not. And when you look at the number of small businesses in New Zealand, these people aren't even drawing the minimum wage themselves.
Is the only way to be competitive to keep wages down?
Well, no. We think a far better way and a far more long-term and beneficial is to look at ways to improve our productivity. And when we totally accept that our productivity is low, but these things take time to roll into business. But if you artificially lift wages, which this is going to do, someone's got to pay for them. Now, when you look at where money comes from to pay wages, it comes out of profit, it comes out of company savings, or it comes out of debt. That's the three only ways that you can pay wages. So if you're not lifting productivity to earn more, how the hell are you going to pay more?
When you say that some companies are doing this on their own, isn't that the whole point? This working group has suggested that because some do it and some don't, you have an unfair playing field. That is why they need compulsion.
Well, I accept that, but the report also talks about some so-called bad employers out there. So if the bad employers, so-called, aren't following existing rules and law, then a fair pay agreement approach isn't the way. Surely that would be fixed by increasing the Labour Inspectorate to go and check those companies to make sure they do what the law currently requires them to do.
So we should have someone looking over the shoulder of every employer to make sure they're doing the right thing?
No, we need to improve and increase the number of Labour inspectors. That's their role, which they're currently doing. But we believe if there are more breaches out there, then the way to fix that is to have more Labour inspectors. Having a blunt tool that applies across the whole nation arbitrarily is a very blunt tool.
Is there not a race to the bottom, though? That list of workers that I gave you, the types of occupations where people are paid less than $20 an hour for working, don't they deserve a better deal?
Look, we totally, as I said earlier, we totally agree that wages should be lifted. But it's how you.
Well, this is a way of lifting them, isn't it? It's a solution.
Well, it's a solution, but there are other solutions, and I think you've got to really accept also that this is a set of recommendations, and the parties to this document were not unanimous in all its recommendations. So this isn't a silver bullet for a very complicated problem.
When you talk about the number of workers needed to trigger a fair pay agreement, so 1,000 workers is what's suggested, or 10% of workers in the specific industry, and I know you are uncomfortable with that, you think it's too low.
Absolutely.
What's the right number? What percentage should it be?
Well, 10% is far too low, and if you're thinking about something in terms of a normal kind of democracy, then you've got to be getting up to around at least the 50, 60, 70% kind of mark. Because
really? Because a government doesn't have to get that much?
Well, I know, but they'd have to get more than 10%.
Okay, so if you had to put a number on it that is fair, what would it be?
Well, we don't believe that there is a particular number. I mean, this is all kind of new, it only came out this morning. We're still analysing it. And it's very hard to put numbers on these things because there are so many other variables that you have to consider. But if that figure of 10% goes through, that's a very low threshold, and we wouldn't be very comfortable with that.
Okay, but there's an opportunity to change this. These are the recommendations. So
yep,
you knew this was coming. Off the top of your head, what do you think is a fair number that would need to agree to it to go ahead with an agreement discussion?
We haven't had that discussion to find out what that number is. We only received the report, like most people, this morning at 7:30.
It's going to make provision, well, the recommendation is it makes provision for a public interest trigger. So even if they don't have enough of the workers who want to go into a fair pay agreement, if they think that there's public interest in pursuing it, they can take it themselves. Do you have an issue with that?
Well, conceptually wise, that's another way of starting a fair pay agreement. The mechanics of doing that and the legislation and the bureaucracy to set up to actually run that is problematic. So it's only a recommendation. We don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know how it's going to run. So all these things are very early on in the piece, and this has got some ways to pay out yet. So we're just looking at the high philosophical topics that it talks about at the moment.
But that suggests that no matter what changes were made to it, you're opposed to it anyway. You just don't want it, regardless of what the level of workers is, regardless of how it's implemented. The suggestion is, and what you've just said, that you just don't want it. Nothing would satisfy you.
Well, partly because when you look at what existing law is in place, and there are after things in terms of minimum wage and all the other bits and other pieces of law, the only piece of law that's not covered under all these proposals that it talks about there is redundancy, and that's also on the government's agenda to look at. So much of what they're asking for is already existing in various other pieces of legislation. So why would we recreate that?
Paul Jarvie from the Employers and Manufacturers Association speaking there.